By the way, Senator Kaine, did you get hold of the, this China versus democracy, which is the
Yes.
report? You had a look at it, did you?
So I have not yet. My team, Nicole Parekha, who's my foreign policy advisor, has seen it. I have been doing a lot of electoral politics in the last 6 weeks, and my
That's very
reading
strange. Why
for
would you have been doing something as strange as
so
that?
I'm a little bit behind on my reading, but I enjoyed talking to you guys about it, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And look, I would very much like to be an ally for Halifax in getting folks who are part of the Biden diplomacy and national security team to invest and come to Halifax in years to come. So just
Well, that would be
let me
absolutely
know.
fantastic, and the thing is, I mean, obviously, it's the person who wrote it. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I mean, I actually do think that I mean, it's obviously like all of the things we do at Halifax. It's a team effort. But
Yeah,
we tried to find a way in as concise a manner as possible for politicians who don't necessarily, I mean, you're an exception in that you're an expert in international affairs and so on, but not every elected representative is like
yeah.
that. And they need to, I think they need to have something they can just refer to. And we also have a set of principles, these HFX China principles, which is really trying to go beyond governments and get people to defend
Mhm.
democracy and not to ignore China's attempts to interfere in our societies or knowingly buy products which are produced via slave labor. So that's something that we're really sort of trying to push, which goes, as I say, goes beyond the political level and the diplomatic level, and tries to engage ordinary people. That hey, you guys have got a stake in that too.
Right. I mean, I think it makes sense. We're all now taking actions at the individual level because of our awareness of climate change. Why shouldn't we take actions at the individual level to show that we care about human rights, for example? I mean, why not? So,
Right. Well, absolutely. Well, this is a nice segue into this discussion, which I'm conscious of your time, and I'll keep to around 10 minutes or so.
great.
And I'll simply just, in a second, I'll make an introduction, say welcome to HFX 2020, and then we're going to go into this question of, this idea that the 2008 Great Recession, in a sense, a lot of people were taken by surprise about the political consequences, the rise of populism, and so on. After that, we need to
Right.
be ready for the consequences after that. So that's going to be kind of my opening question, and then there are
Very
plenty
good.
of logical segues into alliance building and how COVID has
Mhm.
affected that and what we should be looking out for. So
Right.
if you're good with that, I'm good to go.
Let's do it.
Senator Kaine, thank you so much for joining us at HFX 2020.
Glad to be with you again, Robin, and wish we were together in person, but I'm really glad we could do this today.
I wish the same, and this has been a very strange year. And one of the things that's so unfortunate about this, I mean, of course, we have to be conscious that people have suffered tragic losses during this year, is precisely that we can't meet in person. And by any standards, this has been an extraordinary year. And one thinks back to, there have been various punctuation marks in the last sort of 40, 50 years, one of which was just over a decade ago, the 2008 Great Recession. And one of the criticisms that has been made is that we failed to foresee, to be prescient about what the consequences of that were going to be. And I wonder whether you could first of all speak to what you think the generalized consequences for society and politics are going to be arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, Robin, that's a big question, but the way you ask it, it reminds us that the 2008, 2009 problem occurred right before a presidential election. It was a huge factor in the election. And then it set a set of really clear challenges for the incoming administration, of which President-elect Biden was right there from day one as the vice president. And so there's some similarity. I do think we need to foresee consequences. This was one that was foreseen in the sense of we knew there would be a pandemic and the US was better prepared than most. But there needs to be, in my view, like a 9/11 type after action study about why the US managed it so poorly relative to other nations. What are some foreseeable consequences we have to grapple with? Well, first, the pandemic has hit us right at a time when in the United States and elsewhere around the world, there's been a growing awareness of racial injustice. And the pandemic is so clearly connected to that. In the United States, who's getting coronavirus disproportionately African Americans and Latinos. Who's dying of it? Disproportionately African Americans. Who's losing their jobs to it? African Americans, Latinos, young people, women, folks at the lower end of the salary scale. So there's a health challenge that we have to do an after action report to meet future such challenges, but it also raises the stakes to deal with economic and other inequality issues. I think this is a kind of challenge too, Robin, that is sort of right in Halifax's wheelhouse, since Halifax is so focused on the power of alliances. The big challenges of the 21st century don't know borders. Climate change doesn't know borders. A virus or a pandemic doesn't know borders, as is obviously clear. The global refugee crisis, where tens of millions of people at any point in time might be moving here or there because of civil war, instability, hunger, disease, poor government, climate change, that doesn't know borders. So I think a consequence coming out of this, I hope in the United States, will be a realization that we don't need to step back from alliances, international organizations. We may need to reconceive them. We may need to reform them. But I think the need for them has been made even more palpable by this particular challenge. And the good news is, President-elect Biden, that's in his DNA as a former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I think he views the power of American alliances as maybe the most important part of the power that we have.
It's an interesting question as to, obviously there's going to be a lot of goodwill. I say obviously, but one in a sense shouldn't say that, but it is obvious. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of international goodwill from democracies around the world towards President Biden when he becomes president on January the 20th. But this question about, let's just take a step back about international cooperation, because cooperation among democracies is one thing. It's not that easy to cooperate, for example, with Vladimir Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China, when frankly, you simply can't trust the signature they put on a piece of paper. What do we actually do about global pandemic management and cooperation generally when you're dealing with regimes that you simply can't trust?
Well, that is a good question. And I actually don't even think it's necessarily that easy to cooperate sometimes among the democracies. We take for granted the democracies, and yet all of our democracies are showing challenges that we have to work to shore up. With respect to adversaries, it is very difficult. So I think you have to build out from areas where there really are common interests. Both the United States and Russia have a common interest, as well as other democracies, in curbing the aggressive behavior of non-state terrorist groups. I sort of view the current global array of power as democracies, authoritarians, and then non-states. And both the democracies and authoritarians have deep concerns about the power of non-states. And so there's work that we can do together with Russia on issues like that. There's some new domains. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I'm really intrigued by the space domain. We're all putting up all kinds of satellites, not just for defense, but for weather reporting, or, so I can get satellite radio. The more we put up, the more all of those investments are jeopardized if there's not rules about what you put up where, so that all of our investments aren't colliding and then, losing their value. So there's some areas where I think there can be some obvious points of cooperation. And then, Robin, my view on any relationship of distrust, U.S. versus Russia, U.S. versus Iran, you don't go from distrust to trust in a big jump. You go from distrust to trust by finding a few areas that you might be able to work on together, and then checking in a year or two later. Well, you did what you said you were going to do, and we did what we said we were going to do. Then it becomes marginally easier to do the next thing. So I think the issue with China and Russia especially is trying to find a few areas, on which we might be able to cooperate that are in each of our mutual interests, and then use those to build trust for more, more understanding, more dialogue, more progress.
Coming back to specifically that question about cooperation between democracies, the COVID pandemic in Europe is kind of posed a lot of questions about the coherence of the European Union. I mean, obviously, there's Brexit to contend with, which is essentially an existential strike against the whole idea of European integration. But there's also the point that, I was in Europe at the time, at the beginning of March, when the whole thing struck. And the very first thing that the nation states did was to close their borders. And then, of course, there was a big question of the differences between the southern European states, which have been very, very hard hit, and some of the northern states, which have been much less hard hit. Are you worried, as an American who supports the idea of transatlantic cooperation, are you worried about the future of European cooperation and European integration when you look at all these things going on, and the way that COVID, like in so many other instances, has perhaps teased out and exposed raw wounds that were already there?
Robin, I am worried about it, but I would argue the flip as well, that, how do you effectively deal with the virus without an international approach? I mean, I don't know if you've read the wonderful Edgar Allan Poe story, The Mask of the Red Death, where Prince Prospero thinks, I can protect myself if I gather all my friends and we wall ourselves in a castle and we're going to be completely safe from the plague ravaging the land. And then what they find out is, no, the Red Death is in the castle as well. There's no way to deal with a virus. There is no way to deal with climate change and some of the other key challenges we face without more vigorous alliances and international organizations. And again, that may mean we need to take existing organizations and subject them to some tough interrogation. I think the WHO has, some significant explaining to do about some of the things, including willingness to hold China accountable and be honest about what was going on there early in the pandemic, especially. But I think it's kind of like when FDR became president and the League of Nations was collapsing in the early 1930s, even though the US wasn't in it, he started to plan for the successor because he knew if there wasn't a League of Nations, there needed to be something better than the League of Nations. And I think coronavirus has demonstrated I think this way anyway, but I think it's even more evidence of the proposition that we're not going to solve the big problems in the world without effective and vibrant alliances and international organizations. And I see the same thing in Europe. The closing of borders immediately makes some sense, but not forever. The economies are too connected with each other, and we want to get those economies going again. And the only way we do it is if European nations are in dialogue and communicating about best practices and trying to put them in place.
Just coming back in conclusion to where we started out, you mentioned that you talked about the mismanagement of the COVID crisis by the president. Do you actually believe that that was the key to Joe Biden's victory? It was a very tight election, much tighter than people expected. I mean, when things are on a knife edge, one can sometimes argue, yes, there was one thing that just tipped it over. Yeah. Do you think that was what it was?
Well, it was interesting. So having been on a national ticket in 2016, I think there were 5 or 6 but-for causes that if any one of them had changed, then the result would have gone the other way. And that may be the case in this election too, but I do think the dominant issue in the election at the end was coronavirus and a sense of real shame and just kind of embarrassment, because Johns Hopkins did a study that was widely reported in the New York Times in early 2020. Okay, if there's a pandemic, what nations are the best prepared to deal with it? And they said the US was the best prepared. And they were right. We were the best prepared. But right out of the gate, mixed messaging, looking at it through a political lens, not a scientific lens, the differential speed with which other nations embraced testing and social contact tracing and the US didn't. It was going to be tough regardless, but all you have to do is compare the relative death tolls in the US to other nations that have vastly lower GDPs, vastly lower personal income to see that it was mismanaged. And I think that played a critical role in some independent and Republican-leaning voters who just felt like, I know we can do better than that. And then add to it, then they had to feel a comfort level with Joe Biden. Well, Joe Biden had been part of an administration that came in during a crisis and had to help America build an economic ladder out of an economic catastrophe. And they did it. Longest economic expansion in American history as measured by the number of months. So I think it made a lot of voters nervous who had supported Trump before. It took some voters who weren't energized in 2016 and convinced them, I guess these elections, they can't actually be life and death. And then they had to feel comfortable with the ticket of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And they'd watch Joe, who also, I don't underestimate this, Joe Biden has had experience of personal loss and tragedy in his life. And he definitely, as part of his DNA, connects with people in an empathetic way who are going through suffering and challenges, whether it's economic, personal, health-wise. People got that about him. That combination of I've been here before and helped us build the ladder out, and I'm a person who can kind of feel what you're feeling and understand what you're going through, that was all sort of spotlit so vividly during this coronavirus crisis that was a key, I think it was a key part of his win.
Senator Kaine, thank you so much for being with us. And I really repeat, I repeat your words that it's a pity this year we can't be meeting in person, but there is hope on the horizon with these, at least these two super looking drugs on the market. So hopefully this time next year we'll be meeting once again in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
I'm fully expecting that's the case, and I'll look forward to having a lot of good House and Senate colleagues with me when we come back.
That's wonderful. Thank you once again.
Okay, thanks, Robin.
Take care. Bye-bye.